Stephen, what do you see in the States?
Well, it's interesting to think about and add on when we talk about artificial intelligence. I would have agreed, I do agree with the definition, but I would add a couple of Phillips to really understand what we're seeing in the United States. And one former AI expert from IBM has defined it as deep learning, rather a statistical technique for finding patterns in a mass of data. And I think that's one way that we're thinking about it, at least in the applications that have legal use for law firms, but also more broadly. It's not necessarily developing understanding, but it is the ability to learn, make connections. So an example, some people think of artificial intelligence in the US and they're really thinking simply about automation. If you run a word search for the word artificial and you type in ATR instead of ART, it won't pick it up. But if you program it to look for similar words, it'll pick it up. But what if it then decides to search its database, finds that a synonym for this is make up, and then it, on its own, does that? Then I think we're starting to see the reaches, from my perspective, of artificial intelligence and the use in industry. We see it in credit cards, in airline reservations. You're supposedly talking to an intelligent information gatherer. Some of them use slang, although I'm sure they don't know what it means. And we also are seeing it in other areas. The Google chess program, to me, is one of the most significant things, where the computer taught itself chess just from the rules itself, as opposed to having people program in all the openings and all the moves. And the computer was able to beat the other chess program because of this radical approach. And that's the other aspect of artificial intelligence that we're seeing in the US that is still, I think, somewhat prototypical, but will have application, are the face recognition software applications, where if you think about it and extrapolate, you'll see it not just in terms of face recognition, but emotional recognition, almost like a very advanced lie detector. And again, I can't give you specific examples per industry, but this is what we're reading about and what seems to be in development for use. I guess the final comment I would make is that, to the comment about apps or bots, we are seeing that fund managers are using some of these techniques to deal with backroom operations. I was involved in a litigation where there was programming used to maintain and develop repair schedules for airlines. There was a complex set of programming to do that. So it's only a matter of time before some of these other developments add on to that and the suggestions start coming from the software as opposed to just rote automated searches. So it's across industries.
Thanks. Jay, is Canada special in that regard?
Actually, in some respects, Canadians are typically humble, but in the AI space, I can actually say to you that we are amongst the leaders in the world. Let me just also put it into context, because of the fact that although AI was in fact born in 1956, it actually has only come into fruition very, very recently. The McKinsey report actually compares the artificial intelligence boom to the Industrial Revolution. But the distinction that it raises is that unlike the Industrial Revolution, the AI revolution is happening at 3,000 times the speed of the Industrial Revolution. So actually, it's really received traction in the last few years. And by comparison, if you take a look at investments in startups in the last couple of years globally, there have been about $15 billion in 2016, 2017. That's compared to $2 billion in 2013. So it's really caught on in the last little while. In Canada, many of the pioneers of artificial intelligence have found their foundations. Jeff Hinton from the University of Toronto, who's now the director of the Vector Institute in Toronto, was one of the leaders in deep learning. Coming out of his lab is the director of research of Facebook, and in Facebook is very focused on the idea of reinforcement learning, which is essentially, as Stephen was indicating, a type of learning where the machine learns its own rules and creates its own capability as a result of intuition. It was a reinforcement learning that formed the basis of AlphaGo. that was the very famous. And just to put it into context, how we don't really understand the full potential. When AlphaGo was first created, the expectation was that it would take about 10 years to 12 years before AlphaGo was going to be able to beat the Chinese masters of the game. It was a game both of creativity and intuition. People didn't think that a computer could have the type of intuition that a human would. In fact, 2 years later, it was able to beat the five-time world champion in AlphaGo. Within Canada, we have hundreds of millions of dollars of government funding in various institutions, but Facebook has established a reinforcement learning institute in Montreal. Google and Microsoft have expanded hugely their investments within the Canadian market. In Toronto alone, we have about 200 artificial intelligence companies. In Montreal, we have a company, a client of the firm, AI Element, which was established in 2016. 3 months later, Microsoft made a seed capital investment in it. 8 months later, there was $135 million. Basically, an 8-month-old company in artificial intelligence raised $135 million from the likes of NVIDIA, Microsoft, Intel. So there's a lot going on in the Toronto landscape, in the Canadian landscape, rather, in the AI space.
I think Israel, we know that there is huge competition over manpower in artificial intelligence, and we have autonomous driving as a major industry within the high techs. What do you see in the market?
Well, Israel does have tremendous competition over the qualified manpower, and I think in Israel you can see two types of engagements in AI. One would be large multinational companies establishing R&D facilities, as was presented earlier. I can't think of a large multinational company dealing with AI that does not have a research facility in Israel, Microsoft, of course, included, which puts a strain, I think, on the local manpower. And the other part of the ecosystem is the startups. Now, when it comes to startups, it's a slightly different ballgame, because the startups of the world are not going to develop the AI capabilities. It is very infrastructure heavy to develop those. So startups in Israel would usually build upon existing platforms by the multinational companies, by Microsoft, IBM, all these good people, and develop specific applications. And those we see in autonomous vehicles for sure. And it's funny, because if a startup in artificial intelligence for autonomous vehicles was to approach investors and say, hey, this is what I'm doing, I'd like to get funding, they would, in most cases, they would say, we're pretty much invested in AI for autonomous vehicles. The field is saturated, which is amusing considering there's not a single autonomous car driving out there, and the field is already saturated with startups. We also see that in medicine, and of course, Israel's acclaimed security industry. They've been using tools for quite some time. And it's very difficult to pinpoint what is artificial intelligence. When is it autonomous? Is it making decisions? It's an ongoing debate, but I think mostly what we're seeing now for use of AI and the likes is decision support systems. Systems that are not going to be autonomous, are not going to decide on their own, not just yet. They have the capabilities, but what we're seeing is that most startups and most ventures want to offer support to help people make decisions rather than replace them. I don't know if they're doing it so that we'd feel more comfortable with the process, but I think this is what we're seeing in the startup arena, at least.
Okay, thank you. Keita, I think I know of one Japanese company that has a initiative here in Israel, which is AI related, but what is the current state of the art in Japan?
Yes, as Ben briefly mentioned, I think we are seeing booming of AI, the flood of AI as kind of a buzzword. So not a single day goes by without seeing the word AI in newspapers and TV programs. And yes, the Japanese corporates, business corporates, are trying very hard to adopt AI to bring innovation or greater efficiency to their existing models. And it is not only in the manufacturing sector, traditional manufacturing sector, but also in the financial sector and e-commerce, factory automation, and as you mentioned, airline, and the pharmaceuticals. And those the big companies are trying to collaborate with AI startups, and that's something very new in the I think in the Japanese market, because historically many Japanese manufacturing companies are operated on kind of a vertically integrated model where the company does everything in-house, from R&D, design, production to sales. But nowadays it is becoming more common for the manufacturing companies to collaborate with the AI startups in connection with the joint study or joint development of the specific applications of AI to the business models. And one thing I can mention is that this trend is backed by the rise of AI startups in Japan. And so there are a growing number of AI startups in Japan. Japan is not known as the most friendly country for the entrepreneurial mind, but we are seeing this drastic change in this sector. And this is, I think there are two factors. One is that the money is overflowing in the market, so mostly due to the massive quantitative easing policy developed by the Central Bank of Japan. And the zero interest fiscal policy. So money is overflown, and startups have much more easier access to capital than before. And the other is the open innovation trend that I just mentioned. So a big manufacturing companies trying to collaborate with the startups in joint study and joint development. And Japan's key industry is automotive industry. So I should probably mention about Toyota, the leader in the industry. So Toyota is serious in developing the AI technology targeting the automated driving. So Toyota established Toyota Research Institute in California in 2016 with Gil Pratt as CEO. And Toyota has invested in some famous AI startups in Japan, such as Preferred Networks, which is known as the developer of the deep learning framework called Chaina, and Parksha Technology. So I think Toyota is developing the technology by its own self and by investing and collaborating together with the AI startups.
Maybe just one comment. Maybe we should switch. For people, relevant people in this room, so Logix, which is an Israeli startup who has a booth outside, just published today a contest that was held between their AI engine and the leading commercial attorneys that were selected within the U.S. market, and reviewing NDAs and flagging risks. And the AI beat the practicing lawyers by it was, I think, 94% to an average of 80-some% from the actual lawyers. And the difference was that the AI engine did it in 90 seconds, whereas the lawyers took approximately 2 hours. So just to give you, we're losing our jobs soon. So
the question whether or not we're losing our jobs is,
kidding.
we really want to touch on that. But I think what we have established is that AI has a major presence, that it's a growing force. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution, and it's definitely present. And I think one thing that's also very clear is that the legal framework globally is not ready to deal with artificial intelligence. The question of who did it, who's responsible, is it the robot? Does the robot have a separate legal entity? Who's to blame when an automated car hits somebody? All these questions don't have an answer yet. And I know that in different jurisdictions, legal systems are starting to look at this, and this is perhaps a slightly more serious question, but I think for us it's important, and I think some work has been done globally. And Jay, if you can touch on that point. What's happening? What does the Canadian legal system, how does it look to these questions?
Well, it's interesting. Hello? Yes, it's interesting because I think that the systems internationally are very, very distinct. If you look at North America and the United States or Canada, it's very much of a hands-on approach. I think the approach by industry has been to be very, very proactive in terms of establishing what they hope to be self-policing organizations, self-policing regimes. That's very different from the European regime, where the European Parliament recently made a recommendation to the European Commission to establish what some people are referring to as the ethics of robots. And as Mickey indicated, one of the concepts embedded in the European Parliament's recommendation was the establishment of what they refer to as an electronic person. And some people are very concerned that somehow there will be human rights which will be allocated to robots. But interestingly, there's a lot of commentary and this is perhaps foreign to all of us, and I'll just ask you to indulge me for a moment. But essentially, there are comments. There's a blog called Jew in the City. And there's an Orthodox rabbi who has made the comment that if you are able to establish a robot which has self-awareness and self-consciousness and has feelings and emotions and can feel those, can express those emotions, then he does not see any reason why that robot should not be granted the same legal rights as all of us. What's also interesting, and perhaps not surprisingly in this day and age where people are thinking outside the box, there are also articles as to whether or not a robot could be considered to be Jewish. Articles as to whether or not a robot could be included in a minion. And those are perhaps strange enough. In the Journal of Artificial Intelligence from August of last year, very almost hot off the press, there was an article, and you will forgive me for even raising this because it seems so bizarre, but the article was whether or not a robot needs to consent to have to be able to have sex with its owner. Because, as some of you know, in Japan and elsewhere, they are creating human-like robots with the purpose of which is to have sex with its owner. So part of the issue is, can you actually have sex with a robot without its consent? And the truth is that at this point in time, and people will say, for example, if you were to look back 100 years, well, black people are not people. Why would they have human rights? And in the 1920s, 1930s, they would say, well, why would a woman have a right to vote? That's really not the case. That's pretty bizarre as well. So I think what I would ask you to do is apply your values, not necessarily to what exists today, but really think outside the box of what the potential is. Because I think, as was indicated before, artificial intelligence is really taking off, and we have no concept today as to what the capabilities of these robots will be 20, 30, 50 years from now.
Thanks. Omer, I know that our system is lagging behind, but
Oh, yeah. Israel, when it comes to legislation, addressing these issues from the legislator or the regulator's perspective, I think Israel is doing what has done on other advanced issues, and it is to wait out and see what other countries are doing. If Israel is following suit and aligning itself with the GDPR in Europe and has comparable standards, when it comes to privacy, or if we're talking about crowdfunding, then the US model came into play after we saw the Jobs Act regulation and Regulation A coming into play, and A+. So there's really very little discussion about all the issues that we just heard, and Israel, from a regulatory point of view, is probably going to wait out and see what other countries are doing, and I'm sure the other panelists are going to elaborate on that. But there are, I think, the interesting point, not from a regulative perspective, but from a legal perspective, is just as you mentioned, Mickey, when we're talking about technology and AI, we're essentially finding that things that used to be theoretical model questions, like the cart dilemma, will the autonomous vehicle hit the woman and the baby or protect the person in the cart? That used to be a theoretical exercise. There wasn't really a cart there. But now someone has to program it. And can we code Asimov's laws into a car? And that becomes a legal question rather than a theoretical moral one. And let's say you import the car to Israel. Can the regulator in Israel say, no, I don't like your choice there. You need to program your car Israel differently, because in Israel, this is going to be the choice. So I think what it's doing to us, it's forcing us to deal with those theoretical questions and understand that they're going to become practical legal questions that we're all going to have to think about in the future.
no, that's very clear. And I think we have to remember also that, in a way, privacy, which is the flip side of AI, in the sense that this is the first line of defense that people have put up to defend themselves against the massive collection of information by AI systems, is taking off, and is taking off in Israel, as usual, with a slight delay, but with true force. So I think we are seeing some things happening even here in Israel. Keita, what's the Japan regulatory scene?
Yes, in terms of the legislation, no hard form legislation has been enacted anywhere. But there are a lot of discussions across various departments of the government and the legal community and academic society. And the significant achievement was that in 2017, last year, Japan government authored a draft AI R&D guidelines, which include basic principles that apply to the developers of AI. For example, the principles include the transparency and controllability and security and privacy, etc., etc. And those are the attempt to lead the international discussion around the kind of a soft form regulation on the development of the AI, but we will see. And one of the important, interesting things was that during this discussions in connection with the drafting of the AI and guidelines, one famous AI startups of Japan has withdrawn from the discussion because they as developers of AI feel not comfortable in introducing the transparency principle in the development of AI in such an early stage, in a premature state of the current situation. As you probably know, the deep learning process, in particular operation, the learning process can be a black box, which cannot be verified by the human beings. Why the AI produce that result? By what logic? Developers some developers are feeling reluctant to require full transparency in the learning process in this premature technology situation.
Thank you. Stephen?
Off, the last thing you saw was, "Will I dream?" It was very unnerving. And we've all seen the movies. There was a Star Trek episode where they actually decided in a legal trial that the hologrammatic program, while not being deemed a person, nonetheless could have copyright credit in a holo novel it had done. But I like science fiction too, and I appreciate the philosophical questions. But in the US, we actually had a case involving either an ape or a gorilla, I forget which, I'll call it an ape, who was being photographed by a nature photographer. The photographer gave the ape his camera, and the ape took a selfie of itself. The photographer then published the picture. An animal rights group sued on behalf of the ape, claiming it held the copyright to the image. Remarkably, the case settled. And, so the point is, though, and I looked at the pleadings in the papers, and other legal authority pretty much felt that the ape probably would not have had standing and would not have prevailed. I mention that because if our own evolutionary relatives aren't necessarily given legal status right now, I'm not sure a robot would do it. I don't preclude it. Maybe you would bar mitzvah an ape at 13. I don't know. But whether we start applying the human concepts to non-humans, I think porpoises too. You have these challenges for animal rights. I think before we get to artificial intelligence, at least in the US, we're still developing that body of law. In terms of some of the other questions, you're right. Privacy is something where we have regulation already. Federal regulation, for example, requires you, before you access certain financial information of people, as a lawyer, if you're looking to collect assets, you have to satisfy certain legitimate purposes before you get into that. So any artificial intelligence that's used in that regard would presumably be covered by that. When we talk about self-drive automobiles, again, we have product liability laws. You're going to, in my view, be subject to those, to the state of balance of efficiency versus safety issues. We have concepts of agency and principle. Even human beings are agents and principle, so I'm not sure just because an artificial intelligence or a robot is doing something, it's unilaterally liable when you think about people can bind other people. And I think those laws currently exist. We have artificial intelligence being used in development of contracts. We have laws regarding unconscionability of contracts, particularly in the consumer context. So again, do we need separate regulation for AI in terms of contract? We have a developed body of law. Essentially, too, another issue that's coming up in the US is what I would call pretexting, where people call under one set of identification when they're really doing something for somebody else. When we get a phone call from an artificial intelligence entity asking us questions, should it have to identify itself as non-human? And there are some who feel that that may be an area of regulation and disclosure that we need to have. Finally, a point that is involved in artificial intelligence, particularly where you are licensing it and don't necessarily have it under your sole control, are issues of confidentiality, not just privacy. People develop work product, feed it into an artificial intelligence environment. Others may then have it or share it. And for those of us, like in the United States, where privilege is a religion, we need to pay attention to that, and we have rules that govern us as well.
I'll just add one thing. We discussed some of the liability issues and etc. The one other thing we need to remember around AI is the underlying training data. Because again, as I said in the beginning, every AI algorithm needs data to feed on and to learn from. Now, one of the major problems we are seeing right now is the fact that a lot of the data that's feeding back to the AI is biased, is harassing, is aggressive. Does anyone got a chance to connect with a bot made by Microsoft to use Twitter called Tay? So Tay was a feminine version of a bot, 19-year-old basically. And after approximately 2 days, it became racist, it became aggressive, and tweeting to the world basically. And the reason for it wasn't a problem with the algorithm. The problem was the data, because people are racist, are aggressive, etc. So the data that was feed back to the AI prompted it to become racist, to become aggressive, etc., etc. So that's a main problem. And going back to the transparency point, a lot of the requests and the bodies that are thinking about how to legislate AI-related regulations go back to the fact that we need to be transparent about the data we use, about the algorithms we create, and the decision-making process. Because when you think about it, looking to the future, your insurance company, okay, run by an artificial intelligent agent will give you a decision, okay? Your claim was awarded or not, okay? You will not always know the reasons. So a lot of the work that's been done now on the legal framework is around transparency, showing the reasoning behind the decision, and that's a big part of it.
But then, assuming you're right, and you're assuming the problem is in the data, notwithstanding, you could have an AI system which is making decisions about acceptance for work, and it makes prejudicial decisions based on information, and decides to prefer a woman over a man, a young person over an older person, all for very good statistical reasons or biased reasons of bad information. So Stephen suggests that the legal system is in place and we don't have anything to worry about. I'm taking it to the extreme, but so who's responsible?
So
You just can't blame the data and say the data is bad.
No, okay, so basically when you go to responsibility and liability, the legal framework is there, or people will claim it is. You can use negligence law generally, okay? If the algorithm or whoever wrote the algorithm made a mistake in the algorithm, okay, or the data that was fit in was, for example, biased, okay, so for example, you can claim that that party is liable. But again, I'm talking about real life scenarios we're experiencing now, not something we'll talk about in 10 years, about actual independent sovereign AI entities. But right now, we probably would use the legal framework we have. Now, again, the transparency factor is imminent, because if we don't have that transparency in place, you basically have no way to recourse and understand why was the decision made the way it was made. Because, for example, if you want to say that they accepted a woman over a man to a specific position, you need someone to show what was the decision-making process.
Okay, but I think it still raises a question whether or not with deep learning systems there is somebody who can really answer the question.
Yep.
Is there somebody who can pull the plug if the need arises? But we just have a few more minutes, and I want to pick up on something Ben said initially. Will AI threaten the future of the legal profession? And that's really, we know that there are AI tools in place, and some of them are more accurate than what people can do. And I think this is an area where we as lawyers tend to say, okay, let's show them, and if we're lawyers practicing tech, then we say, okay, we have some notion that we can say something about this. But the real question is, and it's more of a question of view than fact, are we looking at a world where machines will replace the lawyers?
So just in a few words, from my end, I think that that AI is meant to augment human capabilities. And if we're looking at lawyers, so I would love to have an AI algorithm running in the back and showing me stuff I would miss, okay? It won't replace me, but it might replace several of my coworkers or me, it doesn't matter, but it will just reduce the amount of lawyers we need. Because a lot of the labor, hard labor, will go away, because an algorithm can do that. will it extend lawyers? I don't think so. I think lawyers will be here to do the more core risk assessment. I think they'll still have, a place, but again, it will help reducing a lot of the hard labor.
Keita, what's your view?
I personally do not think the AI will replace the lawyer work that we are doing right now. But I think AI is a tool that lawyers can use to bring greater efficiency in the work. As I mentioned, I think AI can do the time-intensive work. I would say the back-end operation of the law firm, such as research of the case law, preparation of the decent first draft or document review, something like that. The time-intensive work that junior associates or trainees would do. So to that end, I think AI is a very useful tool, and if we and I think under the current regime, I think we are talking about specific AI. Specific AI refers to the algorithms designed to do a specific task. So, and we are not talking about the general AI that goes like AI. We are talking about specific AI, as long as the specific AI is concerned, I think lawyers can use that AI technology as much as possible, and it is not really the replacement of the lawyer work.
Okay. Steve?
And that's really the question. Lawyers will do different things. We have contracts being drafted and put together, but you need the lawyer's judgment. We have, as I mentioned earlier, face recognition, but unless we get to that point, knowing what question not to ask and having a certain amount of intuition is something that the lawyer will have. There's a backgammon program which can rate you as to how you're doing. And if you make all of its moves, which are based on statistical probability, down to 100%, it'll deem you a great player and you can lose. I play the game, I'm deemed an awful player, and I've won. So I would suggest to you that when we talk about artificial intelligence for lawyers, there still is a place for instinct. There's still a place for equity, for judgment, for basically having certain experiences, which I'm not sure you can program into a computer. There was a study done on case prediction where the authors took, I think it was European Court of Justice decisions, ran them through with facts, the law, to see what the results were. And it was something like a 79% success rate on prediction. Well, in my jurisdiction, about 1/3 of all cases are reversed on appeal, so that's 67% getting it right. Should we have computers be trial judges? Do they have a better chance? It's like your question about whether it says to hire the man versus the woman. There's still a place for policy application. I agree that it does free the lawyers up, like we don't have to operate elevators anymore. If a computer can do certain due diligence, all subject to review, I'm not sure it's any less imperfect than having an associate spend all of that time. I will note, though, I have spoken on this other places, there, just as I mentioned the legal applications that still, at least as of today, apply, the codes of ethics deal with supervision of non-lawyer assistants. Even if a robot were deemed to be a personality, we still have an ethical framework for making sure the rules of professionalism are still in place. So I don't think it costs lawyers as such. I think it will replace certain functions, but lawyers will do other functions and have other, perhaps more sophisticated things that they will need to be doing.
Thanks. I think robots are going to replace lawyers, just not all of them. So definitely the menial labor, the stuff that lawyers don't like to do anyway, but kind of have to do it in the first few years and call it training, is probably going to go away sooner rather than later. And as was mentioned, LawGeeks is a very good example. I think it's the prime example of AI-based legal tech company. And they did indeed have that contest, and their robot won, fair and square. And we see it also in other professions, but I think in the legal world, it's no different. I think one thing that's interesting is lawyers used to view the competition as other lawyers. We compete against other firms in our jurisdiction, in our practice group, whatever it is. And the competition, so to speak, nowadays comes from what is called ALSPs, Alternative Legal Service Providers. Law geeks are not lawyers. They're not bound by ethics at the moment. Should they be bound? Should they be regulated? Perhaps, and perhaps it's one of the 4 stages of grief that lawyers go through in terms of denial, anger, bargaining, and acceptance. But my personal feeling is that instead of ALSPs, for now they should be called CLSPs, complementary legal service providers, and I think they can really make us super lawyers. And what we need to understand as lawyers that type of work requires a very different skill set from what we're used to doing, from what we're used to seeing, from what we're used to, how we're used to practicing the law. Now, my personal feeling is if someone thinks that AI ventures like LawGeeks, for example, cuts the branch on which they're sitting, in my opinion, they're just sitting on the wrong branch at the moment.
Okay, Jay, closing comments. Are we the committee within Kodak talking about digital printing?
Well, I actually think that the future is going to be radically different from what we can even remotely imagine. I believe that when we say that a computer cannot replace the lawyer, I think what we're thinking about is in 2018, maybe 2025, maybe 2030 terms, but I truly believe that if you look down the road for another 30, 40, 50 years, computers will have the capability to have the same kind of and perhaps superior intuition that we have now. But let's not look that far down the road. I think the issue is that computers are radically changing the way we practice. I believe that what will end up happening is that many smaller firms will be able to compete with the mega firms because of the capability to analyze the data. So Kira Systems, for example, a machine learning entity founded in Toronto and used around the world, it has the capability to analyze contracts with roughly 90% accuracy. One would say, well, 90% isn't 100%, but as was indicated earlier, 100% is not what we as human beings are able to achieve. The Kira systems actually can exceed the capabilities of humans. What we seem to fail to do, and I think this will go to the question of how we're dealing with our clients and interacting with our engagement letters, we're not anticipating the needs of the automated system. So when we deal with our client, if a client says to us, we want you to analyze the contract, the client expects and requires 100% accuracy, even though we can't provide it. I believe what's going to end up happening in the due diligence regime is that we're going to be re-engaging our engagement letters, if you will, and saying to the client, we can do one of 2 things. We can save you a lot of money, and we can analyze all of these contracts, but with 90% accuracy, or we can charge you more, and we can perhaps analyze a subset with 100% accuracy, but that's what you expect of us. So pick the scenario where you are doing an acquisition and the target company has, for example, 5,000 contracts that require analysis. The client is never going to expect you to analyze all 5,000. They're going to say, pick a subset, pick 50 and do the analysis of those. You have a choice using Kira of analyzing with 90% accuracy all 5,000, as opposed to having 100% accuracy of a small subset of that. So I think ultimately it will not necessarily eliminate the way we practice, but it will radically change the way we practice.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the panelists. I think we are facing a change. I think smart contracts will take a piece of the action, but I think there'll be plenty of work until then. Thank you.